I got an invitation to a book signing at the Page and Palette. It's a bookstore in downtown Fairhope here in Alabama. Brooke Kroeger would be talking about her latest book, Undaunted, How Women Changed American Journalism. Okay, women, journalism, naturally. I was intrigued. The book is 592 pages that covers an essential history of American journalism, showcasing different women from period to period, unveiling the impact women have had on a vital profession. I am curious. How do you start a book of this scope? Let's find out. This is Living It Up with Lenise.
I'm excited. It's really my pleasure.
So before we dive into the book, I'd like to talk about who you are.
Well, I'm a senior now. For the past 22 years, up until September of 2021, I was a professor of journalism at New York University, NYU. Before that, I had a long career actively in the field, starting as a wire service reporter, then a bureau chief abroad in Tel Aviv, then division editor for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. After that, then I went to Newsday, the newspaper. I was there for a couple of years. I was UN correspondent and then deputy metropolitan editor. Then I freelanced for magazines for a couple of years, 3 actually, and started to get book ideas. And so I've been really writing books since 1990.
So you mentioned Tel Aviv. Wow, that must have been an experience.
That was really extraordinary. It was during the Camp David peace accords, the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Beirut, the assassination of Anwar Sadat, lots of Sturm und Drang across the occupied territories and into Israel. It was really an extraordinary time.
So did you always know that you wanted to be a journalist?
So it started at about 9 years old. I went to the bookmobile every week when it landed on our corner, and was reading juvenile biographies, Booker T. Washington, Clara Barton, Florence Nightingale. And then there was one about Nellie Bly. And Nellie Bly was a journalist of the 1880s and 1890s, mostly, and did the most extraordinary things, starting with, not starting with, but her big splash was getting herself committed to an insane asylum so she could go undercover to expose its terrible conditions. And as a girl of 9 or 10 in the 1950s, thinking that my choices for a profession would be nursing or teaching, both honorable, both fabulous, but didn't quite feel like this. And I thought, gosh, that's really what I want to do. And everything was directed towards that from that time on.
This will be your 6th book. Why share this collection of stories? Or perhaps a more direct question, what inspired you to write it?
I was asked to write this one by the editor, who is a man, a very well-known and admired editor at Knopf. And he went looking for a history of journalism's women in connection with something else he was working on some years earlier. And the way he tells it, he would put Post-its on his desk when he had ideas. And this was one. And often those ideas would just fall away. And in this case, it didn't. And so he asked some colleagues whom he respected who might be the right person to do such a book. He wanted a history of women in journalism from 1840, which is generally considered the start of mass media, up to the very present. And my name came up. He fixed on my name. He cold called me by email and said, I'm looking to commission this book.
I'm looking to commission this book and I want you to write it. Was that pressure?
No, it was, I had just announced that I was going to retire from NYU. So this was like manna. And after I picked myself up off the floor, I wrote back and said, oh, yes, I would be interested in discussing that.
I'm holding the book and I've only just started reading it, full disclosure, but I love the feel from the cover to the binding. It's a deckled edge and I love that. The pages are feathered, the edges irregularly cut, which is somewhat of a rare sighting because of modern binding technology these days.
It's lovely. It's very lovely. Yes, I agree with you.
The book really explores the careers of standout out women reporters who covered major news stories in every conflict at home and abroad since before the Civil War, and it celebrates those exceptional careers all the way up to the present. I'd like to read an excerpt from the book where you write in the preface, "The telling is chronological. It gives precedence to the episodes that dealt with or dovetailed with the most significant news, events, and trends of each period." That meant leaving out many stories and people I would have liked to include. So with that, what was your process in writing this book?
So I love to talk about process. I'm not sure everyone's as interested in it as I am, but I do love to talk about it. So yeah, exactly. So how do you start a book of this scope? It's, I guess, important to say that almost all of my previous books have in many ways led to this. I've written about the history of undercover reporting. I've written about Nellie Bly, a full-scale biography of Fannie Hurst, who wasn't a journalist. She was a short story writer and novelist. She wrote Imitation of Life, which you may or may not be familiar with.
I know Imitation of Life. I saw the remake of the movie. I believe it was the 1959 version, an emotional story, powerful, sad, so sad, full of love and rejection. It is one of my favorite movies. I ought to read the book. She also published hundreds of short stories.
But she wrote often for magazines, so there was a lot of magazine history there. You know, some of the subject matter was familiar, and then, you know, from my college days till now, this is the life I've lived, I've taught, it's what I've done. So the material wasn't entirely unfamiliar. And because women have become so prevalent in the profession, there was no chance this was going to be all inclusive or comprehensive. And so, I know people are going to go, but where is she? And what I tried to do was find the major cultural and historical currents of every decade from 1840 to the present, and then find not the women necessarily, but the episodes, the happenings, the individuals who stood out for whatever reason over against these important moments historically. So how do you do that? So luckily, a lot is digitized now, which especially during COVID became critical, because the libraries closed, if you recall. So a lot of that kind of research I was unable to do after the first year and a half. But what I did was use two words, women and journalism, and applied them to about 15 or 20 different databases that, because of my academic background, I have access to, and then see what came up for the whole decade. So you'd find the names of certain women that would recur. Take someone like Dorothy Thompson, who's quite forgotten, but was absolutely the it girl of the 1930s. So imagine this. Of her, there would be a profile in both the very middlebrow Saturday Evening Post and also in the very highbrow New Yorker, both taking up the better part of 2 issues of each of those magazines. Well, that signaled to me that I had to talk about Dorothy Thompson. What was she? What had she done that made her so extraordinary? In other cases, there are people you will not have heard of, but who had, episodes or things that happened to them or ways they approached their work that were so exceptional and moved the pieces for women. In other cases, it might be, this really only deals with women at the very top of the profession. I like to say women who were doing men's jobs, and that was very few in the beginning, and then more and more and more. Probably the big change comes around 2000, but by then I've already done, 16 decades.
I was explaining this to my daughter and as a whole, how the industry has changed. And you mentioned at around the year 2000, prior to that, it was an extremely male-dominated industry. Was there a particular story about one of these women that stood out to you?
Oh, so many. I mean, in every era, there are one or two, and those are the ones that have found their ways into the book. And even some stories have stood out to me, since the book was done, because I keep looking for material or trying to put pieces together. For instance, everyone is, I think, largely familiar with Gloria Steinem's Playboy Bunny expose. That's one of those pieces that endures. And when Barbara Walters died, NBC had surfaced her doing something similar. This isn't in the book, so I'm giving you an extra piece. And it was dated December 29th of, I believe, 63 or 62. And then because I'd written about the Gloria Steinem episode in my undercover reporting book, putting the pieces together, I realized that they happened 6 weeks apart, only 6 weeks apart. So this is a moment where you see the world change.
Talk about an undercover assignment. So for many people listening, maybe not familiar, Gloria Steinem, as you said, went undercover as a bunny in Hugh Hefner's New York Playboy Club back in 1963. And it really stripped back this glamorous facade to reveal an empire many described as a world of misogyny and exploitation.
Yeah, exactly. But what Barbara Walters had done was do just a story, just kind of a light piece about the Playboy clubs and what it was like to be a bunny. So you could see in that, this was a moment where the world really changed. You know what I mean? Where a completely different way of doing things happened. In Nellie Bly's case, after the trip around the world, she did undercover reporting assignment week after week after week for the next 2.5 years. She would, get herself arrested to see how matrons treated women who were jailed. She would go to an alcohol treatment center and get herself committed. I mean, she would just she would go try to buy a baby in the baby buying trade to expose that. She would expose mesmerists. I mean, just over and over again. And she started a movement, which was called the Stunt Girl movement, where there was at least one woman per paper all over the country called, something like Nellie Bly, Polly Pry, like that. And they would be doing these stunts, which really had an investigative aura, not the same as what Ida B. Wells was doing, not the same as what Ida Tarbell was doing, not many years after. They were doing really hardcore investigative work that involved documents and evidence, not just the experiential. But what you see is that women were very much at the forefront of that kind of work in journalism.
And although they were around during different times, what kind of common ground do you think they shared?
So this is something that has come through in doing the work, 1840 to 1850, 1850 to 1860, in that kind of very plodding way. It creates a continuum where you see what's been happening to women throughout this period. And I think this is true in other industries. I was just on a panel with Kate Zernike, who's written about the women of science, and Reagan Penaluna, who's written about the women of philosophy. And it's a story of progress, setback, push, pull. So women get to a certain point and then something pushes them back. It happens over and over again throughout these 18 decades. I found that, really fascinating.
How do you think journalism has changed? I mean, because you've now chronicled it from the 1800s to present day. What has changed?
In journalism generally, of course, we've gotten much more sophisticated in our tools. But as we all know, in the last, 15 years, we've been in this period of terrible economic decline. There's been a lot in the way. For women, however, it has meant opportunity, because women generally have done better when things are bad, or when men have gone off to war, women get opportunity, or when organizations are failing or teetering, people will try women. I mean, it's kind of a strange, contradictory way of thinking about it, but I find that to be true. I think that economic decline or crises in the industry have been as instrumental in helping women as almost as instrumental as changes in the law, which also mattered, of course. I mean, if you think about it, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it took till 1970 for women in journalism to grasp that this also applied to them. The conditioning was so complete that it took another 6 years for them to have the light bulb go off, that they could use this instrument to change their circumstances within the companies they were.
This book is full of some great career advice. What would you tell someone?
We should talk about television, Lenise. We should talk about television, which you probably know a lot more about than I do. I mean, the question of appearance, which Pauline Frederick was railing about back in 1950, that she had a whole other layer of time used in makeup and clothing and things that her male colleagues did not have to deal with. And I'm gonna throw this out, and you can cut it out if you want. But of course, I was, using my usual techniques to learn things. So I've done a search of you, and I found an article in 2005 where you were in Charlotte, and the article the headline was "The Hottie from Saginaw,"
Yeah.
and I wanted to ask you how you felt about that.
So, Brooke, as reporters, we hate being on the other end.
Listen, you can cut this out, but I had to ask. I just have to ask.
I did not like it. That is not why I became a journalist. It was because I wanted to be an ambassador for my community, to share stories so we can learn and grow.
Exactly.
It had nothing to do with being a hottie.
Lenise, I can't tell you, and you will see this when you read the book, how many times a headline reads like that from the beginning of time, some way to diminish a woman's greatness. Even when, Marguerite Higgins wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1951 for her reporting from Korea, which was extraordinary. She took more risks than anyone. And that her Pulitzer, there are 6 people who win in 51 for the war in Korea, 6, all men and her. And the general citation is, for their coverage of the Korean War. And then you look at the individual ones, and hers has this diminishing gender twist, special consideration because she was a woman, that sort of thing. And this happens in a zillion ways. During the Spanish Civil War, Virginia Cowles did extraordinary reporting, and she was a girl of East Coast society. And so the headlines would say, da-da-da-da, discovers da-da-da-da, and then East Coast socialite finds, complimenting and diminishing, or maybe it's thought of as a compliment. Who knows? I guess we all like to hear something nice about ourselves, but context really matters. I hope you leave it in because it's really interesting, and it's very on point to the book. It's very on point.
And people reading the book, what do you want them to gain?
Well, I want them not to think it's an encyclopedia and pick on me for who's not in it. I hope they don't do that. Yeah, I saw that. And, it isn't an encyclopedia. The stories are meant to be representative of the conditions that women were functioning in during their particular period. And then from period to period to get a sense of how things change. What I hope is that when women triumph, you have a sense of that triumph and the joy, because it happens a lot. And then, get a little upset when things don't go their way. And I also hope that, Aunt Susie will give it to her niece who aspires to be a journalist, because it's full of really great career advice, along with some very cautionary tales.
Thank you, Brooke.
Well, this has been a pleasure.
Living It Up with Lenise is a production of Fox 10 Podcasts and myself, Lenise Lagan. The executive producer of this show is me, with the music provided by Kendall Faust. A special thanks to Brooke Kroeger for this interview. She joined me just before her June 20th, 2023 book signing event at Page and Palette in Fairhope, featuring a conversation with Associate Professor Dr. Diane Bragg of the University of Alabama. Remember to share this podcast, leave a review, and thank you always for listening and for the support.